of DQ, the big boss of DQ. This is his first COP, and this is day one. So welcome to the circus, Mike. We hope you enjoy it. And Mike was going to talk to us a little bit before we start talking about adaptation generally. What are we adapting to in Australia, and what has the government's first national climate risk assessment showed about the risk of various warming trajectories for Australia?
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here, Dan, and thanks to the ACTU too for hosting what is a really important topic of conversation, obviously. As Dan mentioned, I've been the Secretary of DQ, Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, for about 4 months now. And in 1 week, back in September, after I'd been there for a couple of months, we had a glorious explosion of productivity in the department, where in the space of about 7 days, we released our net zero commitment, our NDC, to 2035. We produced a net zero plan with several sector plans. We produced a national climate risk assessment that Dan mentioned, and I'm sure we can get into that. And we released the national adaptation plan, which is in a sense the response to the climate risk assessment for the nation. So it was a burst of extraordinary productivity in the department, for which I can take none of the credit. It was obviously the amazing teams that had done years and years of work on that to get to that point. Those documents, those commitments, all of that taken together as a set, sets the nation up really well. And what I've noticed here last night and this morning is just the extraordinary global recognition of Australia, the department and the government's efforts in regard to putting the nation into such an extraordinary position to mitigate, to avoid, but then also to adapt to the conditions that we're experiencing in terms of our changing climate. And it's important that we have that, in a sense, that hierarchy. We do obviously still need to do an awful lot of work to avoid the worst excesses of climate change, to do the mitigation work, to keep the globe within that 1.5 degree limit that has been set. But of course, we all know that change is already upon us, and we need to be realistic about that, and we need to ensure that our adaptation response is adequate as well. Now, you know, it occurs to us that adaptation is a real indication of what the department has chosen as its purpose statement, really, which is to think ahead and act now. We've recently done the work within the department to say, what is our unique contribution as a department to the Australian community? And we've chosen the language of think ahead and act now. That's what we're uniquely placed to do, and that's what the Australian people expect of us. And of course, that's the spirit. The spirit of that purpose is what we're bringing to the adaptation discussion. There's economic benefits in adaptation. You know, there's certain estimates around that $1 spent on adaptation activity generates $2, between $2 and up to $10 of economic activity. That is one, you know, opportunistic way to look at adaptation. But we also have to ensure that the conversation about adaptation also remains firmly rooted in the consequences for justice. And I think that is a really important consideration. You know, we're very keen as a government to ensure that the opportunities around adaptation are bankable, that they are investable, that they attract global capital and create economic opportunity and productivity within the nation. But all of that can be an incredibly sterile response if we don't stay firmly focused on the implications of adaptation for justice. And that's why it's so important to have the ACTU and other like-minded organisations within our nation so focused on this topic. It's very, very important that we get that balance right and that we keep at the forefront of our mind what this does for our nation, not just in climate terms, not just in economic terms, but also to create a more just country.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Deserves a round of applause. And I think that word bears repeating, justice. And that is what, from the trade union perspective, adaptation is about. For a long time in the union movement, the only unions that would really talk about climate and energy issues were the energy unions, who were mostly concerned about it in terms of phase down of high carbon industries and what would happen to their members. That is still absolutely something we're focused on, but a lot has changed. Even in the last 3 years that I've been on this job, the unions that are paying closest attention now are the unions whose members are being screwed over by the impacts of climate change at work every day. Whether it's teachers trying to teach in a 45 degrees Celsius classroom, whether it's firefighters being asked to go into increasingly terrifying bushfires at the same pay with the same conditions, whether it is home health care aides who are going to the houses of their clients and seeing their clients succumb to heat stroke and feeling like they will themselves. This is an issue that impacts every worker in every sector and is increasingly moving to the absolute core of union business in Australia. So we saw, Mike mentioned the release of the National Climate Risk Assessment. If you haven't read that document, I encourage you to pour yourself a stiff drink and sit down with it. Like, that is a scary document. Predicts that, by mid-century at current warming trajectories, half of Brisbane will be essentially uninsurable under private insurance. Predicts a spike of almost 500% in heat deaths in places like Western Sydney. It produces huge, huge economic losses from decreased labor productivity because of extreme heat. So this is why adaptation is a core issue for unions. It's core union business, and that's why we're here with these distinguished panelists to talk about it. So, in no particular order, because they're all so awesome, we've got Amanda Cahill here from The Next Economy, really one of the leading thinkers in Australia on just transition, and has been doing that work before it was sexy. We've got Frankie Muscovich, who you may know from her podcast, Let Me Sum Up, but is also now the Executive Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change, and Kelly Cott, from whom I've learned a lot, moving to this country not 3 years ago. She is the climate lead at the Australian Council of Social Services, a key and frequent ally of the ACTU. So maybe, Kelly, I'll pass to you first. The Necro was clear that we are far behind the 8 ball as Australia, the driest inhabited continent on Earth, in adaptation, maybe even further behind than we are on mitigation. So what do we need to do to close that gap?
Thanks, Dan. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous people on the lands that we meet, in particular the Amazonian people, and also pay respect to First Nations people back in Australia, many of whom, well, not many of whom, but there is a large contingency here at the COP, which is great to see. So I just want to pay my respects to Australian First Nations people as well. So it's a great question because along with ECRAS, there was a National Adaptation Plan released as well, which was really a bit of a framework. And so there is a group of organisations, including ACOS, the ACTU, and about 75 other organisations that range from climate organisations, civil society, grassroots organisations that have come together under the banner of Renew Australia for All. And in the last couple of weeks, we've just launched a climate safety plan. And this plan has 8 key areas and about 30 recommendations about what we would like to see and how we'd like to see the National Adaptation Plan implemented. And also, which we'll talk to a bit later, we've got some solutions, 4 recommendations about how we can pay for them. So in the climate safety plan, I just want to acknowledge that we're also making it clear that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders are central to this task, and that any effective adaptation and resilience plan must be co-designed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. We need to respect their sovereignty, self-determination, and support with resources their knowledge and leadership. So a lot of their asks are embedded in the 8, but we're also developing specific asks for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as well. So quickly, the 8 areas that we're focused on is climate-proofing homes, schools and workplaces. So this is looking at, for example, Australia's housing stock. We need to improve what's called our National Construction Code, so new builds. We need to make sure our new builds both have energy performance and resilience standards that are going to future-proof our homes for the next 20, 30, 40 years. We also want existing homes in Australia. We've got something like 9.6 million existing homes that have really poor energy performance standards and also not up to scratch in terms of resilience either. So we really want to see investment in that area. In particular, in rental properties, we need standards for landlords to increase the energy performance and resilience of those homes. And as Dan said, we need to put in place worker health and safety regulations designed for extreme heat. So they're the sorts of things we're talking about in that area. We also want to fully fund community services and local government. Community services and local government at the forefront of climate disaster and supporting resilience. So we need to invest both in community services so that they can better support the people that they're working with, especially people that are vulnerable and disadvantaged, and we need to support our local governments. We also need to secure farming and our food supply. So we need greater investment. We're asking for $500 million over 3 years for agricultural research and development. And we also need to fully review food security from farm to table. So they're the sorts of things we're looking at there. We need to boost our emergency workforce. So $600 million for National Emergency Response Brigade and providing $150 million a year for grants to states and territories fire and rescue service. So they're examples of some of our asks there. We also need to deliver climate-ready social support. If you're living in poverty, you cannot become resilient. So we need to do things like increase job seeker to bring people out of poverty. We need to suspend things like mutual obligation during extreme heat and disasters. No one should be required to look for work when there's a disaster. So these are the sorts of things we need to be looking at. We also need to make insurance more affordable. I mean, anyone here from Australia can afford their insurance at the moment? I know I can't. And you can imagine people, again, living on low incomes. It is the first thing they give up is insurance. So we've got swathes of people that are not insured, and yet governments, state, federal, rely on people to be insured to protect themselves. So we need to be reviewing our insurance and supporting people on low incomes to be able to support it. And then finally, centering community voices, experience and leadership in the debate. People on the ground need to be part of developing the solutions for their communities.
Thanks so much, Kelly. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot there for two reasons. One, the adaptation task is huge, and it touches every sector of our society, so we really need this to be an across-government effort. The other reason is because there were 80-plus organizations who came together to make up this plan as sort of a response to the National Climate Risk Assessment. How do we start putting meat on the bones of the National Adaptation Plan? What do we actually have to budget for? What do we have to do in terms of regulatory reform, et cetera, et cetera? Speaking of regulatory reform and legislation more broadly, Frankie, I was wondering if you could talk briefly to, like, you know, Australia just put out its first National Climate Risk Assessment, its first NECRA. How do we start embedding this more into how Australia governs?
Thanks. I'm not sure. Is this working? No? Yes? No? Maybe can you put it up? Yes? Better? Okay. All right, great. It's a really positive step to have a national climate risk assessment and I think a start towards a comprehensive national adaptation plan. But in our view, we're really behind the 8 ball a little bit with the architecture that we've been building up around climate change in Australia. We've had a much more kind of comprehensive and long-run approach to the mitigation side of the coin, and now we need to focus on really fleshing out the piece on adaptation. We would like to see, and this is definitely from an investor's perspective, we want to see legislated requirements for the regular review and update to that climate risk assessment and the National Adaptation Plan. Right now, there's no requirement for those documents to be revisited. And for investors to have confidence to invest in projects, they need to be able to refer to the latest and best understanding of how the science is reflected in the risks that we're going to experience across those different systems in Australia. So, I mean, that's sort of the first and most basic ask. I think beyond that, on the National Adaptation Plan itself, there are some really good suggested actions in there. I think it's also fair to say there aren't firm enough commitments and funding to implement the things that are gestured in towards that plan. And I think that's probably just a fair statement to make. So there are good ideas in there, but if there's no commitment to actually implementing them, then we're not gonna get there. I think beyond that, if you're then sort of thinking about what does the sort of good end state look like when it comes to the approach to adaptation? It's probably going to start to mirror a little bit the approach we've taken to mitigation. So we've now got sectoral decarbonisation plans under our net zero plan. I think having a more kind of fully fleshed out sectoral or systems based approach to adaptation is going to be really helpful. Especially when we get to, the more granular asks, like in line with some of the things that Kelly's talking to there.
Really, really helpful, Frankie. Thank you. And then maybe to talk about adaptation in the context of just transition more broadly, I wanted to turn to Amanda to talk about, what does this mean for job creation in Australia and for, the political economy of the transition as a whole?
Okay, can you hear me now? Yep, great, excellent. I got the good mic. Thanks, Dan. I also want to add my acknowledgements to the Indigenous people of the land that we're meeting on here, and I want to it's been really impressive, the presence that they've held here, and I want to encourage that support for that even more so. I also want to acknowledge that I come from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I want to acknowledge Dr. Anne Polina and any other First Nations people here today. I have the privilege of actually meeting with First Nations people who are working on the ground, and I want to call out the fact that there's a lot of work that is being done, often invisible, often unpaid, and it is the work of adaptation, and we need to find ways to better support the people doing that work and to honour that cultural knowledge. For people who don't know me, I do the Next Economy works in regional areas to help people think about, understand and manage the transition to net zero. I've been doing that work on the ground in coal regions since 2014, mostly in Central Queensland, the Hunter and Latrobe Valley. And there has been a real shift in the last 3 years with the requests that we're getting from communities. It's coming from local government, and it might start out saying, we've got these big renewable energy companies coming in, and we're worried about how we manage that, and we want to make sure that we get the benefits from it. Maybe that's the starting point. In other communities, it's the threat of a closure of a coal power station. What are we going to do about that? But the request has shifted, and I want to give you an example of how. After launching the Gladstone Economic Transition Roadmap, which we did with the local government, we got a phone call from the Economic Development Officer of Hay in far western New South Wales, tiny council, and she said, I have read the 200 pages of the Gladstone Roadmap. I've highlighted everything. I've used up my printing budget to print it out, and I need you to come here and do what you did in Gladstone. And I'm like, I don't even know where Hay is. Do you have any industry? And she's like, no, but it doesn't matter. Our agriculture sector is under threat. We are not coping, and we need to get future ready. So you need to come here and do what you did there. Plus, we've got big renewable energy projects coming in. I see this as an opportunity, but we need to get ahead of it. We need to have our plan, and we need to know what we need investment in. Otherwise, it will roll over the top of us, and we will see nothing except the costs. I was like, wow, this woman's she's ready. So we started looking at renewable energy, and we actually came up with a framework that came from the community. They consulted with everyone, all the different groups. It's a small community, so it was a high proportion. And they said, if you're a renewable energy coming in, this is what we want to see here. This is what we want to see in terms of jobs, investment in housing, investment in roads. And what happened was companies started to come to them because they heard they had a positive plan, they want to do the right thing, and they want to invest for the long term. But she said, that's not enough. Actually, we don't have enough money to do what we need to do with that. So I'm going to get drought resilience funding, and now we're going to do an adaptation plan and think about the economic implications of doing adaptation well. Because we either get long droughts and then we get hit with floods, and it's destroying our agriculture. So we need to understand how we're going to shift the agricultural sector for the long term, and what do we need to do to restore the environment. So we took Drought Resilience Fund but did a climate adaptation plan. State government didn't like that very much, but we called it that anyway. And she's like, now that's not enough, because this is about the economy. How are we going to manage all of this stuff? We've got money coming in, but we need to think about the future economy, not just the next range of industries and jobs and value adding, but we need to talk about well-being. How do we actually do an economy that's going to be for everyone long term? And what was surprising to us is she used the word well-being, put out a call for a forum, and we thought no one was going to turn up because this was the third round of consultation in 6 months, and we actually got double the number of people that we'd had before, because they know that it's their place and they want to build something based on where they're at. And the interesting thing is people wanted to have quite radical conversations about the sort of economy they wanted. And in some ways, they were actually using the words of Dr. Ampolina. They were asking for a forever economy. How are we going to deal with the challenges, but build something for the future? So they were talking about value adding to agricultural produce. They were looking at what are the crops that are going to be able to survive climate change. They were talking about emergency response. They were talking about the fact that people can't get insurance. Maybe they can go back to mutual aid, some of the ways that insurance started in the first place. So they're looking at different economic models. There's a lot of discussion around communities being against the transition, but everywhere we go, and we're working all over the country, actually communities are ahead of where we are in this conversation. And I think we need to be telling more stories about that and supporting the leaders on the ground to do what they need to do to put it into action. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point, Amanda, and it's like important to point out that is the future of this conversation. Like right now we talk about the energy transition and government and NGOs as a change in our energy grid. Increasingly, when you go out to communities, the first thing they'll want to talk about when they talk about climate is the impacts they're feeling. As the impacts get worse, that will be the thing that is most front of mind. And if we're not ahead of that, those impacts are going to tear at the social fabric. And we are not going to be able to pass more mitigation policies because suffering breeds distrust of institutions and of government. And that's what climate action is about, is preventing human suffering. So we really need to make up ground here. I think two other elements that I might raise about the climate safety plan that are critically important from the union perspective. One, as part of this package in that first bullet, we are trying to win a comprehensive overhaul of work health and safety regulations in Australia. So right now, there are no binding regulations on employers to protect their workers from heat waves, from unnatural disasters, from vector-borne illnesses, or from flooding and bushfires. We see workers that are either, forced to give up a day or several of pay, or they have to swim across their driveway to get to work. We see workers who are essentially compelled, again, unless they want to lose wages, to work in heat that is clinically dangerous to their health. So we are trying to, and this has never been addressed. Climate change has never been on the agenda of a work health and safety ministers meeting in Australia, which kind of boggles the mind. So we are trying to put that front and center and really get ahead. The other point I'd make, just to build on what Kelly said about the importance of First Nations adaptation technologies to this overall picture, First Nations people in Australia, over the course of 60,000 years, have already experienced and adapted to significant climate change. First Nations people in Australia figured out how to live through the last ice age. So if there's anybody we can learn from here in terms of bushfire management and freshwater preservation, it is the first Australians who have already gone through a huge shift in the climatic regime and lived to tell the tale. So all of this, unsurprisingly, is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to make us more money, as study after study shows. If you do the proactive investment, the ROI, the return on investment, is enormous. And so how do we find the money now to actually realize that return on investment. So this is like kind of wide open to the panelists here. Where's the money?
Can I start? So there's a few different elements to it, right? One of the reasons we would want to see, can you still hear me? No? All right.
Thanks, Dan. One of the reasons we want to see a national adaptation plan updated regularly is so that we can start to map where does it make the most sense for public finance to focus and where do we need private finance. The public purse is not going to pay for all the adaptation we're going to need. That's just not possible. But what we do have is an existing ecosystem of special investment vehicles, which have been stood up over time, largely focused on the mitigation, decarbonisation side of things. One of the potential actions in the adaptation plan was to look at expanding the mandate of the CEFC to look at resilience. So there's a role for public finance in making sure that we are prioritising helping the most vulnerable in our society, and like governments have a responsibility to do things like update social housing to make it climate resilient. There are things that are the government's responsibility, and then there are things that the government needs to do to help de-risk private sector investment in adaptation. And that probably goes to the broader challenges around our housing stock and infrastructure. Beyond that, there are also some things, if you look at the existing public budget, where you could argue it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep putting money into things like fossil fuel subsidies, which are distortionary signals for investment, rather than focusing on worthier investments such as adaptation. And I'm very keen to unpack that with all of you.
That was a nice segue, fossil fuel subsidies. So we believe in the Renew Australia for All plan that polluters should be paying their fair share to support community and to support this plan. So as Frankie mentioned, there's fossil fuel subsidies. In particular, there's in Australia what's called a diesel fuel rebate that goes to the mining sector and a couple of other industries. We believe this is an inefficient subsidy. It's not incentivising mining to shift to electrification, for example, and it's contributing to pollution. We need to be phasing out that subsidy and using that. It's about $9.6 billion a year and rising. $9.6 billion a year could fund this plan 3 times over. So if we look at phasing that out, we can start investing in some of these things that we need to be doing to support our communities. And we also have another really good idea that I might put over to Jan, because it's his good idea that we are backing.
Sure. And I just wanted to make, from the union's perspective, I wanted to follow up on this question of fossil fuel subsidies. Because obviously, as the ACTU, we represent workers across the economy. So that includes nurses, teachers, firefighters. It also includes coal and gas workers. And so the question of fossil fuels is a difficult one for us. It's one that we are constantly having discussions about. And in our most recent ACTU Congress policy, ratified for the first time ever that all unions support the phase out of unabated fossil fuels by 2050. So that is now union policy. Yeah, I think that deserves a round of applause. Thank you. But the thing that we are in strident agreement about as unions is the need to kill these subsidies. Because even from coal and gas workers' perspective, this is billions of dollars of public money, their money, that is being forked over to the bosses, to these mega corporations, for essentially no reason. So, to take one example, the fuel tax credit scheme, which the OECD has gone into Australia to designate this is an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy. There's essentially no economic rationale for that subsidy. It is merely a product of the lobbying power of those corporations. Now, as a union movement, we believe in democracy. We believe in a democracy unpolluted by corporate vested interests. And so this is a way to strengthen our democracy and to claw back that money. And as Kelly said, if we do just that one subsidy, it could pay for this plan 3 times over. And that's not the only subsidy Australia provides. Our system for taxing our LNG exports, for example, the petroleum resource rent tax, is probably the worst deal of any developed country in the world in terms of its fossil fuel exports, with the exception of the United States, who are in the business of not taxing any of their fossil fuel producers and then essentially selling their social safety net for scrap, which is the Trump administration's policy. That's not what we want to see in Australia. We want the Australian public to get a better deal. So that's why we're talking about clawing back these subsidies and plowing them into adaptation. Frankie, do you have one other thing on this?
Well, I think I wanted to add to that from an investor perspective. You have to understand that we represent the full spectrum of the Australian superannuation industry, as well as global asset owners and managers. And capital will go where it's welcome. There is no reason for Australian super funds to invest in Australia's infrastructure or energy transition over that of other countries if other countries are putting in place the right policy frameworks, the right incentives, without confusing the message. And so, I think it's also kind of worth it bearing in mind that this is a global conversation. We're in a global race for capital and investment. And so if Australia doesn't get its house in order, that investment will go elsewhere. It already is in large parts of the energy transition. And that's not what, our industry would want to see either. I think the other thing that bears reflecting and is a program of work that we need to do in Australia as well is how we account for investment in adaptation. So when I go to Canberra and engage with ministerial officers on the question of adaptation, I think there is very much a hesitancy and a resistance to, exactly this conversation. We know it's going to cost money. There is an honest reckoning about the fact that it will cost money to adapt. But the way that this is reflected or looked at in our public budgets doesn't reflect the benefits that flow from these investments, especially when you're making them in advance of disasters and not just as, emergency response payments after the fact. So we really need to overhaul the way that we do budget process and sort of review the approach to investment in adaptation. Because if you reframe things properly, I think that allows an easier conversation with some of our central agencies, which are really crucial to unlocking the investment that we need.
Yeah. And just to follow up on Frankie's point, to make that super concrete, like right now when Australia does its federal budget, let's say it spends $1 million building a seawall, that seawall will only ever show up in the federal budget as a $1 million debt. Even if it prevents, over the life of the infrastructure, $100 million worth of flood damage to the government. So rationally, you would think that's a $99 million savings to the Commonwealth. But right now, it's a $1 million debt. Now, there are people in the federal agencies who say, if we open up that question, we'll have to open it up everywhere. This is too complicated, blah, blah, blah. We don't really buy that slippery slope argument. We actually think that there are clear instances where an adaptation investment will prevent damage to Commonwealth infrastructure, so Commonwealth liable costs that you can easily measure against each other. And we think, frankly, if this isn't done, if we're only ever, seeing that seawall as an $1 million debt, then I don't know if we're ever going to be able to close the adaptation action gap because we'll be fighting with one hand, or really both hands, tied behind our back.
That's a really good point, because there's a lot of things you could point to that actually are building the resilience and regenerating so that there is enough fat in the system to be able to deal with a disaster that comes up. And those are things like investing in regional processes of engagement and democracy, investing in local government that they can actually deal with things on the front line, investing in homeland communities and remote Aboriginal communities as well, and the work that they're doing on country. These are all costs, seen as costs, but actually that's an investment in communities being able to deal with what's coming down the line. And where this is done well, and I saw this firsthand in Fiji, where we were doing a participatory process to regional planning, and it was all regional planning. But what happened was Cyclone Winston went through about a year after we'd started this process. And one of the NGOs we were working with said, who didn't believe in the participatory process, he thought it was a whole load of rubbish. He was an older man, Fijian man. He came up to me with tears in his eyes and said, "You know I didn't believe in what you were saying." But the village that had gone through this process and determined their own plan, climate adaptation plan, when we got in after Cyclone Winston 3 weeks later, they were sorted, food, water, they'd fixed their solar panels. The village right next door was sitting there waiting for someone to come in and save them. So these are also some things we need to think about if we want really good results on adaptation.
That's a really helpful. Amanda is an excellent storyteller. I'm constantly reminded of this when I'm on panels with you. So maybe before we go to questions, I just wanted to wrap up with Mike. You know, we've been throwing a lot of ideas out here. Obviously, you know, if there's one message to you during this panel, it's like we're trying to fight for more money for you to do the job you do so well, even better. So yeah, just any comments or thoughts you have in closing.
I'll give you the Secretary Treasury's number, and you can help lobby her for me. Look, it's a great discussion, and I've been sitting back and listening rather than making a contribution because I think that's my role here primarily. I think the discussion points to just what a substantial challenge we have in this nation, but also a challenge that's repeated around the world. I'd just make this point that global capital helped get us into this situation, so global capital has definitely got a role in getting us out of this situation.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, the point that investors make is that they want to see a return on those investments. Adaptation gives our nation an incredible opportunity to make that offer to global capital and to global investors, that there is money to be made in adaptation. I know that sounds incredibly callous and harsh, but there is. And so this burden, it is unreasonable and unnecessary for this burden to fall onto the shoulders of citizens and taxpayers. Right? Global capital has a role to play, and we can create the circumstances for that to be the case. There is obviously a role for government investment and government expenditure in ensuring just outcomes here as well, and I think the Australian government absolutely recognises that. The other point I'd just pick up on, based on comments that were made, was the adaptation plan is a framework. You wouldn't expect a government with a challenge that's going to last decades, if not centuries, to blow all of its thoughts and all of its investment and every single last idea in an origin document. This is an origin document that sets the framework and the arguments for how investments will need to be made into the future. And so for those who read the adaptation plan and feel some degree of disappointment around the lack of detail, that's the case that people make, I'd just make that point to you, is that it's supposed to be guidance for future investments. This is something the government will need to return to time and time again at every budget, at every election cycle. Lastly, and you know the point's been alluded to through this whole conversation, we, blessedly, we live in a democracy, and that's very precious, and it's also under strain. You look around the world, and quality democracy is in retreat. I'm fond of reading The Economist, and they have that very, very compelling map of the world which colour codes the strength of democracy around the world in colours from 0 to 10. There are precious few countries in the world that enjoy high quality democracy, and it's in decline. One of the things about maintaining democracy is ensuring that democratic institutions work and deliver for people, but it also realistically provides a constraint sometimes on the pace of reform. And we absolutely need to be conscious of that. And government always plays that balance of how quickly can we reform without straining, you know, the very underpinnings of the democracy that give us the opportunity to respond to these challenges in the way that we do.
Yeah, really appreciate those insights, Mike. And I think everybody on this panel is eager to work with you to turn that origin document, that first national adaptation plan, to one of the most robust NAPs in the world, because Australia needs it. We are arguably the most climate exposed country in the world, and so our NAP should be commensurate with that. I think the last thing I might say in closing, because I don't, panels where everyone's just always in furious agreement, they're not very exciting. So I'll just a respectful, like slight divergence on one of these questions in terms of the balance between public and private finance on the adaptation task. I think from the trade union movement perspective, we think that public finance absolutely has to serve as the core of it, because we see what happens in the delivery of essential services, and many adaptation services are essential, when they risk being distorted by by the profit motive, essentially. So there's a reason that our water utilities, thank God, are public. We've seen what happens in countries where they're privatized. It's often not pretty, especially in the developing world. So there will be some places where, yes, there will be money to be made on adaptation, and that will be a win-win for everybody. But in terms of who's driving this ship, we believe strongly that it is the public, because only the public can keep it accountable to the actual social benefit goals rather than the tertiary goal of profit as a bank shot to social outcomes. So I'll say that. A predictable but important point from the trade unionists at the end here. So I think with that, I wanted to open up for questions. We were going to talk a little bit about the negotiations here. We can talk about it in the question time, but we wanted to make sure that you guys could have your say as well, and anything you're interested in, we're happy to engage with. Julianne, Kelly will be our roving mic specialist.
Thanks for the mic running, Kelly. Julianne Richards from Make Big Polluters Pay, and I might be about to help you spice up the panel a little, Dan, by moving away from furious agreement, and reflect on a quote that I wrote down from Mike that you said earlier, which is global capital helped us get into this situation, so they have a role to help us get out of it. The fossil fuel industry are responsible for more than 70% of historic and current emissions. They are the reason we are in this situation. The panel was talking about redirecting fossil fuel subsidies, which is 100% something the Australian government should have done very long time ago and should do tomorrow. But the other thing to note about the fossil fuel industry in Australia is it's one of the least taxed industries. And if you don't believe me, go to our website, makebigpolluterspay.org.au, where we have a nice little graph that shows how undertaxed that industry is. So redirecting subsidies to help deal with the impacts of climate change 100% should happen, but also addressing how the fossil fuel industry is currently getting away with causing this crisis and not paying for any of the impacts, and the role that the Australian government should play in forcing that to happen. Because you're right, we and the people on the front line of climate impacts did not cause this, but the industry that did is currently being allowed to get away with it by the Australian government.
Great, thanks, Julianne. Does anybody want to respond?
You know, I used to be a politician. And so it's always important for me in moments like this to remind myself of my current role as a public servant, which is to provide good factual information to government so that it can decide things. I'm sure you'll see Minister Bowen wandering around on the floor somewhere. He's the one that you should press that point to.
Although, Mike, I won't make you respond to this, but it is interesting that Queensland government actually increased some of the royalties on the coal industry, and the sky didn't fall in. So there's some precedent there to actually doing this that you may or may not have been involved in.
I mean, I think I would just echo that this conversation isn't going away, right? If you look at our budget, like we've got structural kind of challenges there into the future. So I think it's a timely conversation to be having. And I think investors, who are engaged in stewardship over some of those companies, but are also working, on policy reform in this space, are very much up for that conversation. And I'm here saying some of those subsidies, like they're very much distortionary, and we do need to shift them towards helping decarbonisation. I think it's the right time to have a conversation about where we get revenue for climate action in an increasingly budget-constrained economy.
And on the subject of tax specifically, I think we would say as the ACTU, there's one clear place we should start, which is, I mentioned earlier, the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. This is the main vehicle by which we tax our LNG exporters. Most of them have never paid a dime through that instrument because it is riddled with loopholes because it was written by the gas industry for the gas industry. So if we're going to tax our resource sector appropriately, that's one place we should start. As the ACTU, we've advocated to scrap it entirely. It's not working. There were some reforms done, I think, 3 years ago. The gas industry was all over it, obviously. I'd arrived in the country like a month earlier, so I barely knew where Brisbane was, let alone what the PRT was. Wish I'd been more involved. But in every year since those reforms were completed, the revenue take from the PRT has actually decreased even further. So we want to see it scrapped, and we want a 25% across-the-board export levy. That's a start, we think. I think we had here and then here. Yeah.
I'll be quick. Hi, Michelle Isles, First Nations woman, CEO of the Climate and Health Alliance in Australia. We're part of this climate safety plan and really buoyed that resilient healthcare systems were included because health is always seen as a cost. We've got a $200 billion health budget in Australia, but that is going to existing health services. It doesn't account for the huge public health issues that our health systems are going to have to deal with. And so, calling on health economics to try and get in, for DQ to be considering health, our aim is to get health considered in all policies. So we take this preventative model so that, yes, our workers on the ground, the nurses, the home carers, the like, are not feeling the strain, which we know our risk assessment, is predicting. So, look, it's more of a comment, I guess, but just wanting to ensure that health is embedded, not just seen as a cost, but it's actually an investment in prevention.
Yeah, just a brief one on that. Fun fact, Australia's had a national climate and health strategy written down for, 2 years now, 3 years? And there's no money still. It's just sitting on a shelf. So we'd love to see it taken off the shelf and funded.
I'm looking at Kelly, but I think it's great that we have a strategy, right, but support for it. The thing I was going to say, though, is around interdependencies with other areas. It still shocks me that more Australians die from extreme cold and heat in our homes than many Scandinavian countries. That's a national shame, right? So when it comes to how we invest, from a health perspective, some of the obvious things that we can do are make our homes more climate resilient. And there's a really valid kind of mitigation objective there to tick off too. So I think, just thinking about, I've really actually appreciated the sort of systems view approach to how we're looking at things in the adaptation plan. But there are some of those things where we absolutely need to be focusing work on.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. The Victorian government did some work with helping improve the energy performance of elderly people's homes, and what they found is the actual health benefit to government as well as the occupants was actually higher than the energy bill savings. So, yeah, there's definitely a health savings to both government and people as well as energy bills, and ACOS is just embarking on a big project to try and not quite replicate that piece of research, but look at the health benefits both from a government budget and individual households nationally. So in about 6 to 8 months' time, we hope to have that research available too.
Okay, great. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I see one here and then in the back. Yep.
Yeah, hello. My name is Royce Kermlos. I'm a reporter for Drill, the Saturday paper on renewable economy. I have 2 questions for Mike, actually. The first is, just in the context of this loss and damage question that people are talking about, what consideration has the department given to the ICJ advisory opinion that recently came out that found that states could be held liable for continued fossil fuel development? And second, I just want to go to your comments regarding the political constraints on climate action and democracy, where you were suggesting that the public have to authorize further climate action. I was hoping you could unpack that a little more, given that Australians have consistently voted for climate action at repeated elections, and the current government has a large majority and has seemingly been authorized to take this sort of action.
Well, on the first topic, it's a matter that's under review across government. We're all getting our heads around that judgment and its implications. There's not a lot more that I can add to that at this point in time. I mean, I guess I was just making the general observation that governments in a well-functioning democracy will always be responsive to public opinion. And so, you know, whether it's fossil fuel subsidies or any other topic that we might wish, even from a public sector perspective, that government takes more rapid action on, you know, they've got an interest in being returned to office. And if it was so blindingly obvious that that was a path to more votes, then they would take it. These issues, when seen from the perspective of a national government that has to balance considerations, is always more complex. If it was blindingly obvious, if it was blindingly beneficial to a government politically, it would do it tomorrow, right? Common sense makes sense. What we have to do, what the public sector has to do, and I'm speaking generally now, not specifically on fuel subsidies, what we have to do is present the facts. What forums like this need to do is shift public opinion, is to continue to have that conversation, continue to educate the public about the trade-offs between the long term and the short term, around the various policy trade-offs and investment trade-offs that exist when investment is going into one area rather than another, or when investment in one area is denying the opportunity for investment in another. These forums are the key to democratic action and helping governments to see the need to shift. All I say is that, you know, I'm just repeating the point, trying to find more elegant language to describe it. You know, central government, particularly at a national level, is in the business of balancing considerations in a democracy with their own political interests, usually at the forefront of their minds, to speak frankly. And so you can all, you know, we can all view an issue from a perspective. It's government's role to balance them. And from that single perspective that we all view it in, it's our jobs to make that the broader perspective.
I just want to, I hear this a lot from government, and I have genuinely so much respect, particularly for the public service and people who are doing so much hard work right now. And it is tricky. It's getting tricky again. Things are going backwards after a couple of years of actually things opening up. But another story. I sat next to a guy on a plane flying into Rome. Yeah, I know, privilege. But his job was to fly into Rome because a company was under administration and was being closed. He worked for a creditor company, and he was going to go in and manage that transition and divide up the company, sack everybody. And I was like, how do you do that? Like, everyone's going to hate you. How do you manage that process? And I was saying, look, we're going to be facing that transition with coal. So there's a really interesting metaphor of the work that we do going into a community that's in crisis and in change. And he said, it's actually counterintuitive. At that moment, everyone's in crisis, they actually look for leadership. They actually want the person to stand really clearly and solidly, and they'll push back against you, but they need a clear and consistent vision moving forward. And that's what I'm hearing on the ground, is people wanting the vision and that leadership and that consistency, because this is going to get harder before it gets better. And whose job is it to hold that if it's not our politicians? I think it is a role for the public service to balance the issues, but I want to challenge the politicians around where is that leadership that we need right now, because people are calling rubbish on what they're hearing, and they feel that they're being lied to by everybody. So the more we can stand clear in truth, in evidence, and call out the best in people, the better we're all going to be in the long term.
So if it was that simple, just to get a bit of contention into this discussion, if it was that simple and it was so obvious and there were votes in it, why wouldn't government do it? Well, because there's other considerations. I mean, democracy is a balancing act. And by the way, it's not the public sector's role to help government do that balancing. It's our role to present the facts, and that's what we do. You know, we're the part of democracy that backs the facts. Government's the part of democracy that makes judgments about the balance between leadership and response and the pace of change. There are alternatives to democracy if we want to give those a try.
I just wanted to add to sort of building on Amanda's, having leadership and vision is important, but supporting community to be part of that and to be part of developing the solutions is really critical because it builds trust, it builds social license. So if you're doing both at the same time, we're actually going to come together and solve the problem. Yeah.
Thanks, Kelly. And sorry, I'm being told by the pavilion we are out of time. The panelists will all stick around if people want to ask us questions on the side, but let's give a round of applause again to Amanda, Mike, Kelly, and Frankie. Thanks all.